Okay, so I have no idea how much storage space I have. Probably not a lot. But I'm hopefully gonna be able to finally make this video where I've been making notes about, hopefully I'm saying this right, why you shouldn't be desperate, or really why you can't. I mean, you can, but you really, with the outcomes of being desperate, you really can't. But unfortunately, most people do fall into that cycle, which does nothing but make things worse and put you in situations that honestly could have been avoided, that just lead to you being driven crazy or dying or something. So, wait a minute. Hopefully this will all be the part one. This is probably going to have to be broken into multiple parts. And then eventually, hopefully, I'm going to make a video with like some screenshots where I'm going to read some situations or talk about some situations and talk about what went wrong that caused the situation. Not to try to be rude to the person or the people, but just to kind of be honest about the situation. Some other videos that could like help you know why you shouldn't be desperate are the videos in the How Not to Run Away Lay Low to 18 playlist or something like that. I think that's the title. Where there's a couple of videos about these girls who like just left with random dudes who essayed them and a whole bunch of stuff and then just dropped them off somewhere random in LA. It was something like that. Can't really remember the full situation. And then the situations where people would leave in the same day they would leave their abuse situation, they would go into prostitution, which just shows that they had no plan, or maybe that was the plan, which that's not a plan. That just shows that you really didn't do all the work that you were supposed to do before leaving. And I guess something that I have to keep in mind when it comes to myself, not to try to be rude or anything, but I have always been told that like I understand more than most people my age and even most quote unquote grown people, which I keep forgetting to make a video about the whole quote unquote I'm grown, you're a child complex people who are always Jezebelic, but that's another story. So anyway, my point is, I also know that I have to keep in mind that, well, I want people to listen to this and take this little advice that I am able to give somebody. I know that a lot of people won't. A lot of people just probably watch these videos and they just see um, crazy stuff. Because for one, people in the West have a mental illness obsession where they're really obsessed with mental labels. So I know that like not too many people are going to take heed of this. And it's really upsetting because the people who won't are the people that are going to constantly put themselves in situations where they're getting assaulted in all types of ways when that really doesn't have to happen, to be truthfully honest. I mean, I get that if you're like kidnapped and locked in a situation, but like I don't know, some situation you're born into or you're like stuck in a basement or something. But you also want to avoid situations where you could get kidnapped, because like sure there's the people that like get in through the cash for kids system branches, or they like just get kidnapped walking down the street, or they're born into it. But of course there's also the stories out there of somebody who was desperate and so they ran to some random person for a quote unquote relationship and then they get kidnapped. And I understand that people get victimized, but you really can't have no accountability and always play the victim, or at least always throw yourself in situations where you're going to be a victim. Because for one, what that does is that it just it gives you a whole bunch of different spirits that'll be in your head, making you feel like you're always a victim, even in situations that you're not, which is how you end up becoming a schizonarch, as I call it. Because most people's... Wait a minute. No, let me start over. Because I have a couple of videos about quote-unquote schizophrenia, how it's actually a spectrum, and how there's one spectrum where they're pretty much narcissists, which is why the stereotypical idea of what schizophrenia is actually a quote-unquote narcissist, so somebody that like is always doing things to people but feels like things are always happening to them. And of course all of that is off branches of CPTSD, or at least a lot of mental labels are off branches of CPTSD, and then a few are off branches of PTSD. But I have videos about that. So you don't want to get like that either. You don't want to get to the point where you just end up becoming an abuser yourself because you feel like you can't do anything wrong. People are always doing stuff to you. You also don't want to constantly put yourself in situations that just keep making people do things to you that really didn't have to happen, to where you just end up becoming paranoid. And you feel like people are always trying to do things to you, but really, you're always putting yourself in situations for somebody to do something to you. Which is really risky because, like I already said, that can end up making you lose your mind, and then you can end up becoming actually schizophrenic and a whole bunch of other things. Like the number one way to severe demonization or possession is really any sexual sin, anything like that. And then sleeping around, not just because like of the ritual it is, but also just because like you get a whole bunch of different personalities in you. You have a whole bunch of soul ties. You're tied to a whole bunch of different people. That can make you quote unquote schizophrenic or have multiple personalities, like in a really bad way, because you can't really go through any traumatic situation without getting splits of multiple personalities. But of course there's a certain point of brokenness where you get triggered and you split into another personality or something else. Wait a minute. Or another personality takes over you, but then you never go back to your real self. That's when you start living in the false self and you go really deep into what's called schizophrenia or personality disorders. And I know the mental health system makes people think that you don't have control over this stuff, but I mean, if you have control over your situation and you're not like trapped somewhere, you actually do have control over whether you become reprobate, whether you lose your mind, and things like that. Although, due to the fact that the quote unquote health system is made to keep you sick, to make money off of you and keep you in a victim complex, you're made to think otherwise. Especially with the fact that they try to pretend that mental illness doesn't come from trauma, so they try to make you think that you just walk outside and you become uh, a quote-unquote narcissist, as people like to say. I really don't like that term. I'd rather just say Jezebel, Leviathan, and other spirits, especially since, like, ever since more information started coming out about that in 2020, now everybody's using the word, so now it's lost its purpose, and, like, all the abusive people are running around calling everybody a narcissist, so, like, now there's just no point of even saying it. But there's a lot I could say about that. So hopefully I'll actually have some storage space left to actually start reading my notes now, because I think I said everything I needed to say in the beginning. Oh no, I didn't. Another thing that I forgot to mention, along with having sex with a lot of different people and how that can make you schizophrenic, also drugs, or that and drugs put together. This is why people who call themselves quote unquote prostitutes are more likely, well, not even more likely, they're destined, if they stay in their life, they're destined to become schizophrenic eventually. They're destined to become a schizonarch, as I like to call it, or quote unquote narcissist, whatever people want to say, but they're destined to become that if they stay in that situation for a couple of different reasons. And then a side thing, or the last thing I should say, weed does make you schizophrenic. And there's like so much normalization of drugs, especially in the West Coast. In the West Coast, they did that many generations ago. They called it being a hippie, the Caesar Borgia, love all people. they call to being a hippie and all that, and that's why they've had the drug issue that they've had or have, because they've normalized it for so long. And they try to make it seem like it's a homeless thing, but obviously if you know anything, you know that that's not true. The homeless people are doing it too, of course, because I mean that's what people have been doing here for generations, and they call it being a hippie, like I already said. And this also goes back to something I've mentioned in other videos, which is that in quote-unquote white areas, or mostly white areas, it's legal to really do drugs, and like nobody goes to jail for it. So it's like worse in those areas. I remember Pastor Stephen Darby even mentioned that back in the 2010s, how like a lot of them are dropping like flies due to these different drugs, and how they do more drugs statistically. But that's because they can, pretty much. Like when I lived in the South, police would come and do raids, and they would be giving 11-year-olds 5+ year sentences for smoking weed or supposedly smoking weed. But it's like in the quote unquote mostly white areas, they're on way more drugs at once than I even thought was possible. Like I've seen a lot of people, and I'm like, how are you able to do Xanax, fentanyl, meth, heroin, risperidone, olanzapine, uh, hash? I think that's weed, but honestly, I really don't know. Marijuana, THC, that could be the same thing. I could just keep going. How are you able to do all that at once and live? I didn't even know that was possible. I really didn't. But yeah, so due to the fact that they legalize it in their areas, it's become a big issue. And you notice on the West Coast, they're always saying the homeless crisis, the homeless crisis, the homeless drug crisis, because they're trying to make it seem like it's a homeless thing, but it really isn't. You guys are the ones calling it hippies, and you legalize it in your areas, but in the quote-unquote black areas, which is the South, because that's where all the quote-unquote black population lives, really. Like, people can barely smoke a cigarette without getting accused of something. And honestly, me personally, I consider cigarettes and alcohol drugs, but people don't, because overall our society has really normalized all types of addictions, although they focus on drugs, but there's way more issues than drugs. Honestly, sex addiction will always be the worst one, but that's of course normalized, and it has to be in a depraved society where people are trying to eventually push towards transhumanism, which that could be a whole video of itself. And like I always say, anti-humanism is just a breeding ground for transhumanism, which is where people care more about dogs and roaches and rats and stuff than they do people. Like, you notice that people really hate you, some due to their own trauma, and they call it anti-natalism, or they call it women's rights. And honestly, like I've been saying, what really happened is the whole anti-family agendas, which was made to seem like a racial thing. They tried to make it seem like they were just going to destroy the families of melanated people, but really all it did was normalize the destruction of families so that everybody would just allow their families to be destroyed. And so that's why in every ethnicity you see that people are just beating on, assaulting their kids, and youth are just seen as punching bag sex toys to people, and something to just unalive when you don't want, whenever you want, or to just lock in the closet. And this all gets to the point, wait, no, I forgot something. Also, how people just sleep around, which is symbolizing that they don't care about themselves or other people. And all that pushes towards transhumanism, because people care more about quote-unquote superheroes and quote-unquote aliens and a whole bunch of other stupid stuff more than they do about actual real people. And people rather not be people, they'd rather be cyborgs. All this goes hand in hand. It's all connected. So now let's see if I actually have space to say any of the stuff I was really supposed to be talking about. If I can read my handwriting today. Okay, so I forgot this part. Some videos that I'm hopefully gonna remember to put in the description is I have no idea what HTRA was supposed to stand for. I already mentioned the whole Hollywood guy thing. My video, Perception of Insanity, which mentions some stuff about being desperate. If I'm remembering right in that video, I mentioned how, wait a minute. Okay, I think I'm remembering right. So, I mentioned how, like, when people run away or when people just leave a bad situation, there's other people who will say things like, I forgave, even though they really didn't, but they'll be like, I forgave my abuser, and I ended up staying with them and continued to live with them because I forgave them. But it's not because you actually forgave them. It's because, one, you have a trauma bond, and two, you're codependent, and you're actually using them because you don't feel like you could do anything on your own without them. And so since you don't feel like you can make it on your own, you continue to depend on them. And that's why you didn't leave, and you're still 50 getting punched in the face by your mom and stuff. I think that's what I mentioned, but I could be